There are two. One of the dots that I got to connect through my own lived experience, but it's backed by empirical evidence, is the fact that poverty is solved by prosperity, not poverty alleviation. The goal should not just be to be a little bit less poor. That's nonsense. The prosperity is built by entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs need an enabling business environment, as well as, again, access to affordable, reliable, abundant energy sources.
And what is it that you make here?
We create skincare products. Right now, we have a line of lip balms, body balms, and we have a line soon of skincare products coming up, specifically for the face, and focused on nighttime, the wisdom of the night, because the best beauty ingredient is sleep.
So I was reading this very strange piece in The Economist, and they were all enthused about the African diaspora because they said more and more of the working age people of the world are African. And a lot of them are going to come to other countries to work because in Africa, 15 million people roughly enter the workforce each year, but there are only 3 million formal jobs. And I thought this was actually a terribly sad statement. Only 3 million formal jobs. What a nightmare for all these young people looking to build a career, get some equity, support a family, and they're stuck in the informal sector where none of that happens.
It tells you everything you need to know. Bottom line is, the world has given up on Africa ever getting its act together or providing to its people what the people need. In this case, jobs and prosperity.
And then they notice Africa and they say, hey, I know what we should do. We should make them use solar power. We shouldn't let them use all that nasty planet-warming natural gas and so on. And so, in fact, there's a lot of international money and attention and, in some sense, idealism directed to stopping Africa from doing the other critical thing, which is getting reliable energy.
They come with the same mindset of being usually anti-capitalist, anti-business. Can't you be just like Scandinavia? Well, all of Scandinavia is more capitalist than almost all African nations. Does Bernie Sanders know that? I don't think so. Temperatures are rising. This is unsustainable. If we continue this way, this planet is gonna go boom, right? That's what they've been telling us. Al Gore has been telling us, and I would like to talk to him right now, by the way, because all of his predictions have turned to be wrong. And meanwhile, the guy keeps traveling around in private jets, just whatever, like it was Earth is never going to end. All of those people who have co-opted the concept of caring about Africa and Africans, what you're trying to push for, which is net zero, truly by tomorrow. And insofar as you're telling me, because Earth is at risk a few years down the line, unless we stop everything now, meaning Africans absolutely cannot touch fossil fuels, then you're telling me it is okay for people to continue dying.
Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of our program on the Climate Discussion Nexus documentary In the Dark about energy poverty with specific reference to Senegal and West Africa. I'm John Robson, and today I have with me in the studio Magatte Wade, entrepreneur, activist, and gadfly who grew up in Senegal, and Brenda Shaffer, a professor at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, a senior fellow of the Global Energy Center, the Atlantic Council, and also a contributor to the Prosperity.Poverty Initiative, as well as the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, to discuss how the bogey of climate change is often invoked to argue that Africa should not get what we in the West already have. And delighted to have you with us here, partly because your background is very different. You started out academically specializing in the Soviet Union, which up and died on you. And how did you get from there to this whole question of energy and energy security?
Well, really, energy policies are the core of almost every good policy, like whether it's public health, the environment, economic prosperity, geopolitical power. If you don't get energy right, you can't get anything else right. And unfortunately, right now in the West, we're turning our electricity, the sort of the basis of our energy security, into more expensive, less reliable. While the other half of the earth, mainly China and India and their allies, are having cheaper and more reliable electricity, and we're really creating a huge geopolitical divide. So it's just concerning me to see how the West is really is contributing to its own demise through its energy policies.
And in this regard, at least, I suppose we're not being hypocritical when we try and do the same thing to Africa. But one of the points you make in the documentary is that there's this enormous web of international organizations that lend to poor countries with stringent conditions, one of which is that they not spend the money on fossil fuels. And so you get this curious aspect of security where African nations lose a lot of their sovereignty to unelected bodies. And that's a huge problem for governance from top to bottom.
Right. So, I mean, in the last decade, you've had the G7, the United Nations, the World Bank, International Energy Agency, all saying there shouldn't be public finance. There shouldn't even be investments, but there shouldn't be public finance for fossil fuels. So this doesn't really affect the West because the West isn't dependent on loans or public finance for its electricity system. Someone wants to build a power plant in Europe, Canada, the United States, private capital is going to go to it. But this essentially dried up any investments in fossil fuels for Africans. And there's sort of these myths that somehow, just not having access to fossil fuels and mainly distributing solar energy in Africa, that somehow this is leapfrogging to the future. But the reality is really stark, where most people that are now being counted as having electricity access in Africa, newcomers to it, with solar, it's just partial. It's a lantern in a home to charge a phone, but it doesn't really replace the toil that fossil fuels, can, and with the agricultural equipment, with fertilizer for modern synthetic fertilizers, and so this idea that that Africans should have to do with less. And we're having the first time in history that we have backpedaling on access to electricity because mainly in Africa, because of our international energy policies that are being set in Brussels, in New York, in Ottawa, but not in Africa.
Yeah, and of course, this is one of the many problems with governance in Africa, that the disconnect between regimes and their people. A lot of it's driven by the fact that the governments get so much money by doing what Westerners tell them to do instead of by doing what the local people actually want, including, obviously, in Senegal.
I mean, we always go back to he who makes the money, he who makes the gold makes the rules.
The golden rule, yeah.
As long as we Africans remain the poorest region in the world, we will be told by others what to do, especially those who supposedly finance all of our needs, which is what foreign aid is. This idea of government-to-government aid, which foreign aid is, then these other governments who get to give you the financing get to also tell you what is it that they want to finance, what you do with this financing, and if they don't like it, then they hold the purse string. So that's pretty much what it is. Look, at the end of the day, for me, the situation is very simple. As long as we remain poor, we will be told what to do. We will be at somebody else's agenda. We will be following somebody else's agenda. What we need to do is build prosperity. But to build that prosperity, we need economic freedom and we need access to affordable, reliable, abundant energy sources. So this is exactly the reason why the job of organizations like Prosperity Not Poverty matters, because we do need these other voices who are saying, no, the only way out for Africans is to build prosperity, and for that, they need to have access to affordable, reliable, abundant energy sources. And this is what's needed right now.
And you mentioned the purse strings, and this is a very important point. Some years ago, I did a documentary on the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And through the Magna Carta, you establish this principle that it's the people of England, in this case, who hold the purse strings. And this is how they control the king and prevent him from jailing them without proper charges, from waging wars that don't benefit the kingdom, from imposing excessive taxation, all the things that Magna Carta says thou shalt not do. This is the critical point, that the populace, through the parliament, can yank the purse out of the king's hands. But when you get all these international organizations, the purse strings aren't in the country at all. They're somewhere on Wall Street or Washington or Brussels. And this means that whatever the governments are doing, they're not subject to a veto by their own people. And that's just a huge, you almost couldn't have a worse flaw in governance.
Right. So, I mean, over the 20th century, we've gone from a handful of democracies, maybe 4 or 5, to over half of the countries in the world being democracies. And that was an incredible development. But from the 80s and 90s, we're actually backtracking in democracy with the rise of unelected institutions like the European Union, the power of the growing power of the United Nations, that unelected institutions where are now taxing us, are taking a big part of our prosperity, especially in the West, and trying to tell us how we should use energy, how we should organize our economies. Everything in the name of climate. They're trying to deny freedom. Last year, the United Nations tried to, through its International Maritime Organization, tried to tax as a carbon tax, shipping. This would have raised global inflation by 2 to 3%, and the money that they would have gotten from the shipping, because there are no available low carbon fuels for shipping, they would have basically, it was just a cash cow for the United Nations. Now, unlike many of our democratic governments, where we could tell politicians, hey, let's see the budget. What are you doing with this? We at least in theory we have control over the purse. These international organizations, they hardly even will open up their budgets, and let alone, you can't vote them out of office. You can't push them out of office, right? So this creeping role of international institutions, of unelected officials, I think it's one of the most pressing issues right now in the international system. And we hardly even feel it. Because again, they scare us, whether it's COVID or whether it's climate change, that you just scare us into giving up our liberty to these unelected bodies.
Okay, so that's what's coming down from on high. But what's the picture from below for those who are trying to generate wealth and the reliable energy on which that wealth depends? Welcome back to the program. No matter where you live, it's easy to satirize the tangle of red tape and petty tyranny that governments inflict on their people. But it's actually worse in poor countries. It's worse in the extent of it, and it's worse in its crushing effects. And it's not worse because they're poor. To a large extent, they're poor because it's worse. And Magatte, you actually run a business in Senegal, so you've been through the process of trying to get approval so that you can actually give people opportunities and make their lives better. What's it like there?
Depends where do you want to start and how long do you have? Just
Well, where
kidding.
would we start? Yeah, here, I have an idea. Now what?
Yeah, so most of the time, for anybody wanting to start a business, the first step is you register your business, right? You have to have a legit business. So you have access to all the goodies that come with having a business, bank accounts, so you can also have loans, and your employees have a status where they can use their paycheck to then go and be able to rent an apartment, all of this good stuff, or even, be able to buy a home or land or whatever. So in many African nations, that process alone takes forever compared to, let's say you're in the US, it takes you 15 minutes, sometimes less, to just, depending on how fast you type, to just register online with your Secretary of State's, website. Then you get your paperwork, everything is done within minutes, you're in business, and it costs you maybe a couple $100, but no more. But in many African nations, that's really not the case, even though many of them claim, oh, we have a one-stop shop, 24 hours, everything is done. No, 24 hours is after you have brought all the paperwork that's needed. And the devil is in the details. Those paperwork, some of them can take you 6 months to get. Maybe somebody has to go and chase down a birth certificate, but maybe their parents did not really tackle that when they were, born. So it's just all of this maze of paperwork that you have to go fetch and then bring it. And then from there, supposedly the machine takes 24 hours. That's just for the rest of us fools who are looking at it, be like, oh, look, Senegal is great because it's only 24 hours to get registered. No, look at the details. And then, the labor laws. On paper, Senegalese employees are among the most protected employees there are in the world. But like I like to say, if I can't fire you, I can't hire you. And so, I think there's an article that just came out. Europe is falling in innovation. Why? They're tying it directly to the labor laws, because in Europe, it takes a lot of time and money to let go of any employee that you have. And so what do companies do? They fear having to hire somebody in the first place. And I mean, for people who are trying to understand, what is she talking about? Well, think about it. If you two want to get married, and I tell you, be very careful, John, and Brenda. Because once you get married, the minute you get married, it's going to be really, really almost impossible for you to get divorced. I don't care if Brenda's cheating on you or if John is beating Brenda. It doesn't matter. You are stuck. Do you really think the two of you are going to get married? No, you're probably going to live together without the marriage thing. And so that when it comes to move along, you can move along without being trapped. This is what it does. And so all of these things are there together. And then the other thing is energy. If you don't have access to cheap, reliable energy, what happens? In my case, you have your machines that get stopped in the middle of production, and some of this stuff is very critical because, for example, in the case of our lip balms, if you don't raise the temp, if you don't melt it at a certain temperature before you cool it down, it will affect the lip balm at the other end because it's not that the product is going to be bad, but it's going to create some little grainy sand on the texture of it, which your customers like, no way for this. And on top of that, your machines are basically burning all the time because on off, the power is like on off, on off, on off. So it burns the motor. So you have to go buy another one or another fridge or another, which costs more money. And also, it means you just never know when you're going to be able to really produce or you're going to be able to make it to the end. So what does it mean? Your planning is completely screwed up. So a customer was expecting, products to come in, and it's not coming in. The shelves are empty. When your shelves are empty, if it happens too often, you lose that shelf. They kick you out. So you lost a customer. So it's all of this. It's just so entangled. And when you don't even have those problems, it's the cost of electricity that inflates your cost of doing business. And then which means because your electricity costs so much, it means you're going to have to charge the customer a little bit more for a product that really shouldn't be costing that much more. Customer is not stupid. They're not going to buy this because they're like, this is too expensive. Well, it's not your fault. It's because of this energy that's too expensive. So, and then most of the time, like Brenda was saying, yeah, and renewable is all nice. I am all for renewables. I'm for any energy as long as it's affordable, reliable, and abundant. The problem with renewable, definitely not reliable, and oftentimes not abundant, and which means you need to still have access to the grid. The base load there is what's needed, and most of the time that's tackled by fossil fuels. So oftentimes, what does it mean in real life for us is when the renewables when electricity is not working anymore, we have to then have access to backup generators. Usually it's diesel, kerosene, which is even worse for the environment than otherwise. So this is what it all means. It's just that's and like you said, it's not because we're poor that we have no access to electricity. It's because we don't have access to affordable, reliable, abundant energy that we are poor. And it's very hard for people to understand that. But I sit here and I'm thinking to myself, it shouldn't be that hard to understand. So this is pretty much what it means. And the lack of access to this energy is keeping us in a very bad state of poverty.
And one interesting thing, when we went to Senegal, I pretty quickly realized that most of the street front businesses I was seeing just weren't registered at all.
When the chancellor of Germany a few years back just went to my country, while in the same breath, in my country, they're saying we should not tap into our fossil fuels, in this case, the gas, enormous gas that has been found in my country. There are also trying to negotiate for that gas to go straight to Germany.
Yeah, and obviously this problem of hypocrisy is a very big one. So we'll talk more about that after the break. And poverty is often this vicious circle, as we know, that there's a link between a lack of education, poor health, and a degraded environment. And all of these things feed back on one another. So when we come back, we want to talk about how do you break that cycle? Welcome back to the program. And when we went to Senegal last year, and this was the first time I'd ever set foot in Africa, which I'd always dreamed of doing, we had some general idea what to expect, but we're also careful to keep our eyes and our minds open so we didn't just see what we'd gone to see. And unfortunately, one depressing thing that we discovered in consequence was an astonishing amount of trash, most of it apparently imported somehow. And it wasn't just a blight on the landscape, it's a real barrier to the development, particularly of a dynamic ecotourism industry that otherwise offers real hope to Senegal. And especially, there were just bits and pieces of used tires everywhere. I was completely baffled by these tires. And one of the things I asked a couple of people in Senegal, like, what's the deal with these tires? And they went, what tires? So people sometimes just get used to something and see it as a situation, not a problem. And they've got to see it as a problem with a solution. But how do you clean up a country when you're so poor? I couldn't imagine how you'd start to dispose of all this stuff.
Well, I think it's like with anything in life, by sometimes when a problem has been left to run or to run for too long, eventually becomes this massive mountain of issues that every person can see. And then you're like, oh my God, where do I start? And this is where we say, start from the beginning. All the countries you have seen in the world have started from the beginning. European nations for the longest time were as dirty as it comes. And so was probably, America when it was just getting started. What happens is with prosperity, people get to clean up their act. And so that's why for me here, let us not be bogged down by all what seems like a massive, consequences here. And let's go back to the basics. The basics is, at the end of the day, you solve most of your problems with prosperity. So go back to the basics. In this case, the basics are give people economic freedom. People, meaning the entrepreneurs, wealth creators, give them economic freedom on one end and affordable, reliable energy, affordable, reliable, abundant energy, get out of the way, let them get to work. And as they build better lives for themselves and others around, and the money is starting to flow, what happens when you have food in your belly, a roof over your head, your kids are in school, you don't have to worry about if they're sick, how do I help them? You start to rise above on the Maslow, the pyramid of Maslow. You're starting to next think about the quality of the air that I'm breathing, the quality of the water that I'm drinking. What are my politicians doing? You start to think about all of these things, and eventually, as you start to look into them and care about them, and actually have even disposable income to maybe finance some think tanks to go do some research and find out about all of these things, then we come up with policies, things get better. And you also just start to be able to do things for yourself. So for me, especially when it comes to Africa, this is what we have to go do. But instead, the world looks at the consequences of our poverty, and then they come up with the Sustainable Development Goals of the World Bank, 17 goals, and vanquishing poverty within the few next decades is one of them. And I look at the other 16 goals, and I want to argue, guys, these 16 goals are a direct result, for the most part, of this one called poverty. So why then are we spending 90% of our time, energy, and money trying to deal with symptoms of poverty? Why? We should be doing the reverse, spend most of our money and time dealing with poverty, knowing that when we do, all of those other ones go poof, 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 poof in the air. And so for me, it's like, yes, it's overwhelming. The consequences of this poverty is overwhelming, but let's go back to basics and start from where we need to start. Get the prosperity going, and all of these other issues, we see them fixed. People talk about climate change and they worry about the environment. A serious environmentalist should be serious about prosperity building, because we do know, I'm sure you know the curve, when countries get to a certain level of prosperity that was afforded by access to, energy, including fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is mostly responsible for all of this, giving us a prosperity. We know that in places, when a country gets to a certain level of prosperity, we have more trees, better air quality, everything. It just follows. So, and all of that is made possible thanks to energy, thanks to the fossil fuels. And I think when people understand that, then all of a sudden they can relax a little bit more, and again look at the long game. This is not something that gets fixed within.
Yeah, and Azerbaijan's an interesting example there. I got to go there the year before. And of course, they've got oil developed under the Soviet system, but now the Soviets are gone. But they do have a lot of pollution problems. In the Caspian Sea, I was like, I'm going to get to see the Caspian Sea. It was such marvelous thing because I read Prince Caspian as a kid. But you don't see a lot of people windsurfing and swimming because they've got a backlog there at least.
I don't know. I've swam many times in the Caspian
Oh, you
Sea.
have?
I
Okay.
think it's wonderful. I enjoyed it a lot. But following up on what Magatte was saying, that we in the sort of the common language, clean energy refers to non-fossil fuels, low carbon energy, and sort of the assumption is that fossil fuels make things dirty, are polluting. But it's exactly the opposite. Every person needs some form of energy. There's not an energyless person. So if you don't have access to fossil fuels, what most people are doing is they're for their energy sources, they're burning dung, they're burning wood, they're burning vegetation. One of the biggest threats in the world to public health is actually indoor pollution from this smoke. If you've traveled, you talk about your travels, you travel to any place that doesn't have regular energy access, the first thing you notice is actually the smell in the air of the burning vegetation, dung, and wood. And actually, this is much more sort of the traditional renewable energy from burning vegetation and dung it's actually more polluting and more carbon emissions than replacing it by fossil fuels. But the international organizations like the International Energy Agency, even though they know that fossil fuels if it replaces traditional biomass, it lowers emissions, it lowers pollution, it improves health, still they treat fossil fuels almost like a religious issue where even though fossil fuels would solve the problems and reduce these health threats and pollutions, still they don't want people in Africa to have them. So it's really treating fossil fuel, and the same thing is with clean water, right? If you in your travels, if you water that isn't treated, it's not most places. It's not naturally clean. It's not drinkable. It's not humans that do that. It's actually using fossil fuels to clean the water, to purify it, to give more water access. Same with sanitation. So if you definitely if you want to in a responsible way to deal with the trash, these piles of trash you were talking about, you need fossil fuels to run those machines, to run those sanitation systems. So this idea that fossil fuels somehow polluted things, even you see the minute fossil fuels hit the United States, we had return of forests, like more forestation expanding in places. As Magatte said, as people get wealthier and have more reliable access to energy, their amount of their forests and public spaces that they preserve grows. So we really need to change. Stop thinking about fossil fuels, especially natural gas, which which has very little. Coal has an impact on air pollution. And then in general, all of I think this idea, we also need to change that people use the words renewable energy and green energy as if they're interchangeable. But they're not. Go see a solar. I call it solar, not solar farm, because that makes it sound much nicer. Nice little farm. But when you see industrial solar plants, wind plants, mining that's now become green because it's used in renewable energy. Like how can we twist that and turn mining into something that's somehow it's environmentally friendly just because it serves renewable energy? So we really need to rethink a lot of the concepts.
Yeah, like solar factory is a better name. And of course, also when the windmills or the solar panels are done, how do you get rid of them? Those things are those are anything but clean.
Right.
But again, I just realized, because I mean, many years ago when I traveled, I went to India, and I remember getting out out of the airport, and there was an exotic smell in the air. And you know what it was? It was burning vegetation.
Right.
I hadn't really quite connected that up till now. But that again, before we worry about getting rid of the solar panels, is that phenomenon of breathing indoor particulates and smoke is and yeah, as you said, there's almost this religious feeling. Oh no, but natural gas is somehow sinful inherently.
Yeah.
But compared to cooking with scrap wood and with the environmental degradation that brings too, the pressure on, especially, I mean, Senegal, people may think because Senegal's in West Africa that it's in the rainforest, but it's actually on the edge of the Sahara zone. We saw camels there, which again is very exotic, but you realize that people are trying to provide for their needs for cooking and so on by scrounging wood and spending hours every day doing it. And that's an extraordinary thing to condemn a whole lot of people to, that by and large you're never going to meet because you live in comfort in the West. Now, nobody wants to live in a garbage dump, whether it's literally a garbage dump or sort of a corruption garbage dump. So when we come back, we're going to talk a bit about how to clean it all up, from bad government to the unsafe water that you referred to those bits of clapped out tires and the endless scraps of plastic bags that we encountered everywhere we went in Senegal. Welcome back to the last segment of this episode. You know, even in a country like Canada or Britain or the United States, where a lot is going wrong, there's a lot to complain about governance and so on, we can still take a lot for granted when it comes to cultural capital, but widespread revulsion at corruption, and this belief that problems generally do have solutions. So, what do poor countries need? Constitutionally, political culture, otherwise, so they can have our problems and not theirs. When you advise governments, as I know both of you do, what's your basic checklist? Here are the things you really want to try and get in place or get out of place.
Yeah, I think energy is essential to almost every public good. Whether it's economic prosperity, whether it's geopolitical power, and we've really, in the West, we've really knocked ourselves into a corner where, by choice, because of connecting use of fossil fuels with potentially impact on climate change, we've decided by choice, with no one forcing us, to make our electricity less reliable, more expensive. While on the other side of the earth, China, India are roaring ahead with use of coal, having cheaper and reliable energy, and we're not going to be able to keep our freedom, really, if we continue along this path. So we're giving it up to international institutions like the United Nations, like the EU, unelected institutions. But at the same time, we're basing our economies on expensive and unreliable electricity, and until we take a U-turn, the West is really going to be in trouble.
Okay, and so do you have a kind of a checklist? Do you sit down with them and say, okay, here are the main things. These are the ones you just got to get right?
I mean, in my case, it's when I talk to my fellow African nations, it's very simple. At the end of the day, poverty is solved by prosperity, not poverty alleviation, which is sadly what many people focus on when they look at the developing world. So poverty is solved by prosperity. Prosperity is built by entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs need two things. Again, I might sound like a broken record, but entrepreneurs need two things: economic freedom on one end, and access to affordable, reliable, abundant energy sources. You get those two in place. That's the only things we need government for, really. Get out of the way. Let the magic happen of when entrepreneurs are free to enterprise. And then from there, they'll go on to build the prosperity that's needed. And the economy goes on, and voila. So on economic freedom, this is where you hear the governance piece. So in my case, what I am recommending is not so much for these type of reforms to happen. I'm recommending more an approach towards the creation of zones, special economic zones, China. The miracle of China lifting 800 million people out of poverty in a record time happened thanks to the SEZs, special economic zones, that are among the most free market zones in the world, where you get the energy that you need, you get the free market that's needed, and then look at what happened. So I understand that it's very hard oftentimes to get an entire nation to do the reforms that's needed at a nation level. So what we advocate for in exchange instead is the creation of special economic zones where you have world-class governance, including world-class business environment, so entrepreneurs can enterprise. And there too, you get to leave freedom to the zone in terms of what type of energy sources and mix that they're going to be running. And so we're hoping that allows for nations to provide a sort of proof of concept showing that this works. And then from there, eventually the rest of the country can just adopt it because they've seen. But right now, I'm worried that a lot of the fights are about, should we do this, should we not do this, and who gets to decide on all of that. So that's pretty much has been my approach. But when it comes to the energy piece, we are very grateful to the type of work that people like Brenda are doing, because the research is pretty damning. It's pretty indicting, which is finding it. It shouldn't be rocket science, but it's good that we have people measuring all of this. So your work is critical.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It is amazing how many people think, I'm sure a lot of our audience, that, oh, well, if we just give more money and more time, we could just have all renewable, energy. And which, as we know that renewable energy cannot work without a baseload of fossil fuels or nuclear energy. And so essentially, in contrast to a lot of the propaganda that as if renewable energy is so cheap because the sunshine is free and the wind blows for free, but you cannot deliver that energy reliably to the homes and factories if you don't have that base load. And so in a sense, when we add a large amount of renewable energy, we add a lot of costs because we're running two energy systems at one instead of one energy system, let's say it was just on natural gas. And also in terms of the geopolitics, for some reason we think, well, if we get off fossil fuels, then we don't have dependence on Russia and the Middle East. But you go from dependence on Russia and the Middle East to actually strengthening China for most of the hardware. And this is part of the story of Africa too, that with the West isn't going to fund fossil fuels, isn't going to fund electricity in Africa, China sure is willing to come in and to do that. So we're also, not only is it not reducing need for fossil fuel, it's actually giving China really a door into the geopolitics of Africa. And also, I think, as Magatte pointed out before, encouraging dependencies. So instead of people having local electricity and being able to establish their own businesses and agriculture and not have to import food and import fertilizer, if they had their local grown electricity. What we're telling Africans to do now, I mean, this is amazing. In the recent report of the International Energy on so-called on clean cooking, that what you should be doing instead is living off of carbon credits, which is basically a new form of dependence. Telling people don't use energy, and we'll reward you to this with carbon credits. So you're telling people just sit around and get money, now from Europe or international institutions, but don't actually have your own businesses and your own prosperity.
We're not even getting the money on top of that.
It would go just to the a certain elite of people. Yeah,
absolutely. And also, what we have seen is especially all of these carbon credits that the West gets so excited about. I know because I used to be one of them. So proud of myself because this company I'm buying from in the West. They buy all these carbon credits, so technically we're net zero. My purchase to them is not adding more carbon to the environment. And I would feel so good about it. But what it meant is exactly what Brenda is talking about. And we see a lot of actually countries in the countries like the UAE, doing a lot of this. They show you a lot of this, look, we're carbon neutral. When our planes fly around, all of it's carbon neutral. Why? Because they pretty much hijacked most of Kenya, where they're saying you can't do anything here because that's pretty much how it works. We dirty up the planet. We ask you to stand down. So for every one carbon unit we put out there, it's basically offset by the fact that you didn't put the same one unit out there. So 1 plus 0, 1 plus minus 1 equals we're back to 0, right? So we're neutral. You get to fly your planes and live your life. I'm stuck on the ground doing nothing. But hey, we should all be happy. This is exactly what's going on. It's a complete joke. And the truth is, it can't go on because that Kenyan person is not going to stay in Kenya if things remain this way. People are going to keep on moving out. And then we come into the immigration problem that the rest of the Western world is talking about. We haven't even gotten into it, but that's a whole nother thing. Everything is linked. For people listening to us, I really want them to understand we don't live in a closed ecosystem. Everything is linked. And if you want to deny this to Africans, two things are going to happen. Push them into the arms of Chinese and Russians, which you had said are your enemies. And at the same time, boatloads, literally, of our young people, and anybody who can escape is going to escape, and they're going to come to the shores of countries where things are working. Yours. And then you're going to cry and have these political fights and battles about, do we have sanctuary cities or do we build a wall?
So basically, a policy that's sold as being all good is just all bad in incredible ways. There's a lot more we could say, but we don't have the time to say it. So I'm going to wrap up by thanking you very much, Brenda Shaffer and Magatte Wade, for joining us for this discussion of issues that are so critical to human well-being, to security, to all the things that we hold dear. Thank you all very much for joining us. And as we wrap up this episode, I want to ask you please to think about the things that help make our societies, our economies, and our governments work, and how we can be sure to preserve them at home, as well as to help extend these blessings abroad instead of undermining them. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and again, thanks for joining us.